Good morning. I'd like to begin by thanking the Chair and members of the committee for the invitation and opportunity to speak today and share my research findings and thoughts. Before I begin, however, I'd like to just let everyone know and draw your attention to the fact that the Center for E-Democracy, which is an organization that's dedicated to generating, translating, and disseminating scholarly research findings about how digital technology is impacting our democracy and our society, is releasing a report that looks at how Internet voting in local elections in Ontario impacted election stakeholders such as voters, candidates, and election administrators, and that report was released today on the Centre website. So thank you. I have structured my remarks to speak to the applicability of online voting with respect to the guiding principles of accessibility and inclusiveness, engagement, and electoral integrity. I'd like to make clear that when I am speaking about online voting, I am referring to remote online voting, which means being able to cast a ballot from a remote location such as work, home, or perhaps overseas. There are other types of electronic voting, such as from public kiosks or via electronic devices at a polling place. These latter options allow for tighter control by election officials and hence can minimize some risk. However, remote online voting offers electors improved access and has the greatest potential to reduce costs associated with casting a ballot. It is the only type of electronic voting reform that represents a substantial step forward in terms of voter access and convenience. Voting accessibility is becoming increasingly important for Canadians. Turnout in federal and provincial elections has experienced a general trend of decline over the past 25 years, notwithstanding a few recent increases which have to do with the contextual considerations in those elections. At the same time, however, voter turnout in the advanced voting period in the same elections has risen significantly. Why is this? Well, there have been some changes to the advanced voting structure that may have created additional opportunities to participate, such as extensions in the number of advanced voting days. Generally, it appears to be part of a trend also mirrored in other advanced democracies, such as Australia and the United States, whereby voters are opting to vote in advance of Election Day. Voters in these countries are also using other remote voting methods more, such as voting by mail. In the recent Australian federal election, for example, overall voter turnout was the lowest it has been since compulsory voting was introduced in 1925, yet advanced participation at the polls was around 24%. This is up 16.9% from 2013 and 8% in 2010. Taking into account votes cast by mail, about 34% of the votes in that election were cast before Election Day. The fact that voters are so readily making use of the early voting period and other remote voting methods signals that the contemporary voter wants options, or rather choice and convenience for voting. There is also evidence that improvements in access can address some of the reasons for non-voting from Elections Canada's Survey of Electors and Statistics Canada's 2015 Labour Force Survey. In recent elections, the frequency of the explanation of everyday life issues becomes the largest category provided by non-voters to explain why they did not participate. This includes rationales such as being too busy, out of town, illness or disability, weather conditions, or transportation problems. Online ballots can enable voting in situations of everyday life or health issues. These reasons for non-voting should be on the radar of the committee in their consideration of voting reform. Access can be particularly important for special groups of electors, such as citizens abroad or military overseas, persons with disabilities, young people away at post-secondary schools, the elderly, and members of Indigenous communities. 10 countries presently have active Internet voting programs, and 5 of these initiated the reform to improve voting access for citizens or military overseas: Armenia, France, Mexico, Panama, and the United States. Jurisdictions that have implemented these programs seem content with the added access for voters, and as such, some have expanded the program to the entire electorate, such as Alaska. Should the government decide to adopt mandatory voting, for example, it would also be important to introduce reforms or measures to improve voter access to the ballot box, such as additional advanced voting days, vote centres, or remote online voting. Regarding the implications of online voting for engagement, first on turnout. A recent study of Internet voting adoption in Ontario municipalities by myself and my colleague Leah Stokes, Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, finds that the voting reform increases turnout. Examining 5 elections from 2000 to 2014, we find that Internet voting increases turnout in Ontario municipalities by 3%. These results are consistent with findings of other research on convenience voting reforms, such as voting by mail or early voting, and these studies find effects in the 2 to 4% range typically. Other voting reforms the committee is considering, which are larger changes, may not have much larger effects on turnout. Adopting a PR system, for example, can increase turnout by 5%, while compulsory voting laws show a much larger change with an average increase in turnout of 7 to 16% in advanced democracies. However, even in places where mandatory voting is already established, such as Australia, for example, there is talk of further improving turnout. Voter participation is complex, and no one institutional reform will be the silver bullet. In terms of policy design and what the voting reform should look like if introduced, we find that when registration to vote online is not required, 35% more people choose to vote by internet. We also find that there is less uptake of online voting when it is offered in the advanced voting period and not on election day. So if offered, I would recommend offering online voting on election day. A word about non-voters. Evidence in Canada and in other countries with established online voting programs, such as Estonia and Switzerland, shows that online voting brings some infrequent voters into the voting process. Particularly in Canada at the municipal level, there is evidence that people who previously were eligible to vote but did not were brought into the voting process when online voting was offered. Age and engagement. Online voting typically appeals to voters of all ages, though not disproportionately to young people, as is often thought. My research on Canada and findings from other countries, such as Norway, show that the youngest voters, those aged 18 to 25, are more likely to choose paper over online ballots, perhaps out of symbolism or a ritual for the first time participating. Emerging research from Switzerland finds that while older voters are likely to use online voting and remain loyal to the voting method, young people are more likely to try online voting once and then move back to paper ballots or back to abstention. So, older voters will use online voting, but it's not the solution to engage young people. Some final words about electoral integrity. Though security, authentication, and verification must be managed carefully, our lives are increasingly moving online. I am of the view that the modernization of government institutions is inevitable, and whether online voting is proceeded with or not, we are going to see technology creep into other aspects of the election process, such as voters' lists, voter registration, and ballot tabulation. Thus, the government needs to give due consideration to research in this area and how voting technologies might apply to the unique contextual circumstances in Canada. The integrity of elections should be a foremost consideration of parliamentarians. While some changes may raise questions about the impacts of certain reforms, taking no action, a decision in itself, could also impact citizen trust and faith in elections and Parliament. If online voting is implemented, its deployment should be carefully thought out, researched and trialed in a select area or with a particular group of electors prior to broader development. Finally, process is very important. Electoral reform is not something that can be rushed. It is much better assessed as part of a careful and deliberate process. While a trial would be a practical step forward and change is inevitable, large-scale deployment needs to be well-researched, considered, and planned. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very rich in insight and I guess I could say the latest information. And also much of it seemed at first blush from where I'm sitting counterintuitive. So we're looking forward to really delving into what you said in more depth.